The day I came home from the hospital with my arm in a sling and a discharge summary in my bag, I thought the worst was already behind me. I was wrong. The worst was standing in my kitchen wearing my husband's shirt, and she had the nerve to ask me if I wanted coffee. I remember standing in the doorway of my own home, the house on Ridgewood Crescent in Barrie that I had helped pay for, that I had painted the trim on myself 3 summers ago, and thinking that maybe I was still on painkillers and this wasn't real. But it was real. The mug she was holding had the little chip on the handle that I'd been meaning to glue back for months. She was that comfortable, that settled, like she belonged there and I was the one who had walked into the wrong house. My name is Carol. I'm 52 years old. I'm a registered nurse at Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, and I have been for 24 years. I raised 2 kids in that house. I shoveled that driveway every winter. I planted those hydrangeas along the front walk. And that afternoon in October, I stood in my own doorway like a stranger, while a woman I had never seen before made herself at home in my kitchen. My husband, Market, was sitting at the table. He looked up at me and I watched something pass across his face. It wasn't guilt. I know what guilt looks like. I've spent 2 decades watching people on the worst days of their lives, and I know when someone is afraid of what they've done. What I saw on Marcus's face was calculation. He was already working out what to say. "Carol," he said, "I was going to call you. 21 years of marriage, and that's what he opened with. I was going to call you. I didn't scream. Didn't throw anything. I set my bag down on the floor inside the door, picked it back up, and walked back out to my car. I sat in the driveway for 11 minutes. I remember counting the time on the dashboard clock because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and my brain needed something to hold on to. Then I drove to my mother's house. My mother, Sandra, lives 20 minutes away in a bungalow in Innisfil that she's had since I was a teenager. She has a small garden she tends obsessively and a cat named Jeffrey, and she is the most stubborn, opinionated, fiercely loving woman I have ever known. I pulled into her driveway thinking she would open the door before I even knocked. She always knew when something was wrong with me. She used to say she could feel it, like a shift in pressure before a storm. She did open the door before I knocked, but she didn't pull me inside the way I expected. She stood in the doorframe with her arms crossed, and she looked at me the way you look at someone who has just disappointed you in a way you were half expecting anyway. "Marcus called me," she said. I blinked. "He called you. He said you walked out. He said you've been under a lot of stress since the accident, and he's worried about you." I had been off work for 6 weeks with a torn rotator cuff from a fall in the hospital parking lot. 6 weeks of physio and painkillers, and Marcus being very helpful, very attentive, very present. I understand now why he was so present. He needed to know exactly where I was. "Mom," I said, "there was a woman in our kitchen." She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "Carol, you know how you get when you're not working. You need to talk to someone. A professional." I stood on her front step in the cold, and I understood, in the way you understand things that you don't want to be true, that he had already talked to her. Probably more than once. He had laid the groundwork. He had been telling her a story about me, about how I was struggling, how I wasn't myself, how he was worried, and he had been telling it long enough that when I showed up with something that sounded impossible, she already had a framework for disbelieving me. My brother Daniel lives in Barrie too, about 10 minutes from me. He's a plumber, a good man, coaches his kids' hockey team on weekends. He called me that evening while I was sitting in a Tim Hortons on Dunlop Street trying to eat a sandwich and figure out where I was going to sleep. "I talked to Mom," he said. "She told you. She's worried about you. Marcus is worried about you, Daniel. Did she tell you what I saw?" There was a pause. "She said you're not in a good headspace right now. After everything with the shoulder, I am telling you that I walked into my house and there was a woman there. In Marcus's shirt, making coffee." Another pause. Longer this time. "Carol," he said carefully, "the way you talk to someone who is fragile, sometimes when we're in a lot of pain, and we've been isolated and we haven't been sleeping well." I hung up. I don't apologize for that. I could not sit in that Tim Hortons and listen to my little brother read from a script that my husband had written for him. I called my daughter, Megan. She's 27, lives in Hamilton, works in marketing. She's quick and sharp, and she had always seen through Marcus faster than I had. I thought if anyone would believe me, it would be Megan. She answered on the second ring. "Mom, Dad already called me."
Of course he had.
"He called you before I did. He said he was scared for you. He said the pain medication has been making you see things that aren't there." "Megan, I know what I saw. Mom. Her voice was tight, controlled. You have been isolated for 6 weeks. You're in physical pain, you're barely sleeping, you've been on Percocet. I was weaned off Percocet 4 weeks ago. I am on ibuprofen. I know the difference between a hallucination and a woman standing in my kitchen. There was silence then. Just come stay with me for a while, you can rest, we can talk. I'm not coming to stay with you so you can watch me like I'm unstable. I heard her exhale. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. Your father told you a story and you believed it. I checked into a Super 8 off the highway that night. I paid for 3 nights on my visa. I lay on the bed in my coat because I hadn't thought to pack anything, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about how you can spend 24 years being the person who holds everyone else together, and then one day, when you need someone to hold you, you find out that none of it works in reverse. I called my coworker and closest friend at work, Patricia, the next morning. She's been an RN for 30 years, she's practical and unshockable, and she has never in her life had patience for nonsense. Tell me everything, she said. So I did. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then, are you safe? Yes. Do you have money? I have my own account. I always kept my own account. This was true. It wasn't distrust, just habit. My mother had always told me, keep something for yourself. A piece of your own life that doesn't go through anyone else's hands. Okay, Patricia said. Don't go back to that house without someone with you, and call a lawyer today. Not tomorrow, today. I did. I called a family law lawyer named Angela, who had an office on Bayfield Street. She was calm and methodical, and within 20 minutes of me sitting across from her desk, she had already identified things I hadn't thought to think about. Has your husband made any large purchases recently? Changed any account access? Moved money? I didn't know. I had been off work for 6 weeks and not paying close attention to our joint account because Marcus had been handling things. He had said he wanted to help. I had thought it was kindness. Angela told me to get the statements. What I found, when I got the statements, is that it had not been kindness. Marcus had opened 2 lines of credit in both our names over the previous 4 months. Not credit cards, lines of credit, the kind that require income verification and a signature from both parties. I had not signed anything. I had not sat with any banker. I had not agreed to anything. My signature was on those documents, but I had not put it there, $63,000. I sat in Angela's office on a Thursday afternoon in October, and I looked at that number and I thought about the trip to Portugal we had talked about taking. I thought about the retirement savings I had been careful about. I thought about 21 years. Then I stopped thinking about that and started thinking about what came next. Angela contacted the financial institutions. My own bank, where I had been a client for over 2 decades, acted quickly. A fraud specialist named Robert walked me through the documents line by line. The signatures didn't match mine on file. Not the slope, not the pressure, not the size of the loops in my name. He was professional and careful, and he told me that this was not an unusual situation, which should have been comforting and somehow wasn't. We will be filing a report, he told me. This constitutes fraud. Fraud. The word sat in my chest like something cold. The Ontario Provincial Police file number arrived 11 days later. Marcus was interviewed. He told them that I had agreed to the accounts and later become confused about it due to my medication. He actually said that. Medication. He had built the whole architecture of my unreliability on 6 weeks of a prescription I had barely used. I want to tell you that I was angry. I was. But underneath the anger was something quieter and more durable. I had been a nurse for 24 years. I had sat with people in the worst moments of their lives. Real fear, real pain, real loss. And I had learned a long time ago that falling apart in the middle of a crisis doesn't serve anyone, least of all yourself. So I didn't fall apart. I kept a folder. I responded to emails within 24 hours. I ate actual meals. I went back to physio. And I started slowly to rebuild. My friend Patricia had a spare room and she told me to stay as long as I needed. I moved out of the Super 8 on day 5 and into her house in Angus, about 20 minutes north of Barrie. She has a golden retriever named Biscuit, who decided on day 1 that I was his personal responsibility. He slept at the foot of my bed. He followed me to the kitchen in the morning. When I couldn't sleep at 3 a.m. and came downstairs to sit on the couch, in the dark, he came and put his head in my lap and breathed slowly until I stopped shaking. I don't know how to explain what it meant to have that dog's uncomplicated loyalty when every human relationship I thought I could count on had turned sideways. He didn't require an explanation. He didn't need to hear both sides. He just stayed. I went back to work in November, 6 weeks after walking out of my own kitchen. My supervisor, Lynn, had kept my shifts available and called me the week before I returned to check in, not about paperwork, just to ask how I was doing. I had to hold the phone away from my ear for a moment because I wasn't expecting it. The first shift back was hard. My shoulder was still tender. My concentration was fractured in a way I had to actively compensate for. But I was there, in my scrubs, doing the work I had done for nearly a quarter century, and there was something solid about that. The hospital didn't care what Marcus had said. My chart notes were clean, my patient outcomes were on file. 24 years of showing up, of being precise, of doing the job right. That was a record that existed whether he liked it or not. The police process was slow. These things always are, but it moved. The forensic document examiner confirmed what Angela already knew. The signatures were not mine. The case was forwarded to the Crown. Marcus hired a lawyer. My mother called me in December. It was the first time we had spoken since the front step in Innisfil. "Carol," she said, "I owe you an apology." I sat down at Patricia's kitchen table. Biscuit looked up at me from his bed in the corner. "Marcus came to see me," she said. "He wanted me to write a letter, a character letter, for his lawyer. He sat in my living room and he talked for an hour and then he asked me to help him." "Did you?" "No." Her voice was careful, measured. She was 81% of my stubbornness. I told him I needed to think about it. And then I sat down and I thought about what he had actually said to me over the last several months. And I realized that every single conversation was about you. About your stress, your mental state, your confusion. And I thought, when did Marcus start calling me? Before the accident or after? She had done the math herself. That was so like her, she didn't need anyone to explain it. "Before," I said. "Yes," she said. I checked my call history. 4 months before. He started calling me 4 months before you came to my door. The silence between us was not comfortable, but it was honest. "I should have believed you," she said. "Yes," I said, "you should have." We didn't cry. We are not a family that cries easily, which has its advantages and its disadvantages. But she asked me what I needed, and I told her, and she listened in a way she hadn't before. Daniel took a bit longer. He called in January on a Saturday morning, and he started with "I've been thinking," and then talked around what he meant for about 4 minutes before I said, "Daniel, just say it, I should have listened to you." I took Marcus's word and I didn't think about why he was calling me in the first place, and I'm sorry. "You got there eventually," I said. "That's not the same as getting there when it mattered." "No," I agreed, "it's not." But I also understood something by then that I hadn't understood in October. My family hadn't been cruel, they had been handled. Marcus had known exactly which buttons to press with each of them. He knew my mother respected professional concern. He knew Daniel needed a framework of worry before he could engage. He knew Megan was quick and decisive and would move fast if he got to her first. He had studied the people I loved and then used them against me. That realization didn't make it hurt less, but it made it make sense in a way that helped me stop taking it personally and start looking at it clearly. Megan drove up from Hamilton in February. She showed up at Patricia's door on a Sunday afternoon with a bag of groceries and the expression of someone who had been practicing what to say and then decided to throw away the script. "I'm sorry," she said, on the front step. "I should have driven to that Tim Hortons and sat with you instead of trying to manage you from the phone." I let her in. She made soup. We sat at Patricia's table for 3 hours and talked. Really talked, the way we hadn't in longer than I wanted to admit. Megan told me she had always found Marcus difficult to read and had convinced herself that was her problem. I told her I had spent years doing the same thing. "You know what's strange," she said at some point. "He never once asked how your shoulder was healing, in any of those calls. He talked about your mental state, your stress, your confusion. Never once asked if your arm hurt." I thought about that for a while. She was right. In 4 months of very concerned phone calls to my family, Marcus had never once mentioned the actual injury that had started all of this. Because the injury wasn't useful to him, the injury was straightforward and sympathetic. He needed something murkier. The court process extended into spring. I will not walk you through all of it because some of it is ongoing, and some of it I have been advised not to discuss in detail. What I can tell you is this. The lines of credit were addressed. My name was removed. The institutions cooperated. Some of the money was recovered and some of it was not, and I have made a decision to count what came back as a win and not spend my remaining years grieving the rest. Marcus pleaded to a reduced charge in April. I was not required to be in the same room with him. My lawyer attended on my behalf. I sat in Patricia's kitchen with a cup of tea and Biscuit's head in my lap and waited for the call. When Angela called, she said, "It's done." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you." That was it, that's what I had. The divorce was finalized in June. 21 years, and the paperwork took less than an afternoon to process. I am not going to tell you that it didn't hurt. It did, not in the way it might have if I had still loved him at the end. I think I had stopped loving Marcus a long time before October. In the quiet way that you stop trusting something, slowly, without a clear moment you can point to, until one day you realize the thing is just gone. The hurt was more like grief for time. For the version of my life I thought I had been building. I'm in a different house now. A townhouse in Barrie, not far from the hospital, with a small backyard and big windows in the kitchen that let in the afternoon light. I have been in it for 4 months and it still sometimes surprises me when I wake up and realize I can hear only what I want to hear. That might be the thing I was least expecting. The quiet, the specific texture of a silence that isn't being managed. Patricia's birthday was in July and I made her dinner. Biscuit came along because Biscuit goes everywhere now. He splits his time between her house and mine, which was Patricia's idea and which he seems to find perfectly reasonable. I went back to full hours at the hospital in May. My shoulder is good. My concentration is better than it was before all of this, which I find faintly absurd but also true. There is something about going through a fire that burns away whatever you were using to avoid paying attention. I am very present now. My patients can tell, I think. Lynn mentioned it in my last review. Said something about how I seem settled in a way that's different. I didn't explain. But I knew what she meant. My mother and I talk every week. We don't talk about Marcus. We talk about Jeffrey the cat, who is 12 and imperious, and about her hydrangeas, which she has expanded this year into a new bed along the back fence. She came to see my townhouse in the spring, and she stood in my kitchen with the afternoon light coming through, and she said very quietly, "I like this for you." That was enough. From my mother, that was more than enough. Daniel brought his kids over in June. They're 8 and 10 and they ran through my backyard and found a garter snake under the fence, which the 10-year-old picked up and the 8-year-old screamed about, and it was very normal and very loud, and I tested it at my back door watching them and thought about how much I had been missing this. Not this particular afternoon. I mean the texture of ordinary life. The snake. The screaming. The dirt on small hands. The sound of children who don't know yet that the world can do what it did to me. Megan calls twice a week now, more than she did before. She came up in May and we drove out to Wasaga Beach on a Tuesday afternoon off-season and walked the empty stretch of sand while Biscuit lost his mind over a piece of driftwood. She asked me if I was okay, meaning really okay, not okay for the circumstances. I thought about it. I said, "I think I'm getting somewhere I've never actually been." She looked at me. "Just mine," I said. "Whatever this is, it's just mine." She didn't say anything. She just nodded. The way you nod when something is exactly right. There are people who hear what happened to me and they want to know if I'm angry. I am asked, sometimes, usually by people who are angry on my behalf. I understand the impulse. What Marcus did was deliberate and calculated and methodical. He didn't stumble into it. He planned it over months, cultivated my family's doubt, and used a legitimate injury to dress up his fraud as my confusion. That deserves anger. But I find that I'm not carrying much of it anymore. Not because it wasn't serious, not because it didn't cost me, but because I have learned, 24 years of working in a hospital, that the people who hold on to their anger after the crisis is over are not the ones who heal the fastest. Anger is useful when it moves you forward. Once you're past the obstacle, you have to put it down or it becomes the obstacle. I still have the folder. I will always have the folder. Angela tells me to keep it for 7 years and then we'll see. But I don't look at it. It lives in a filing cabinet in my spare room and I know it's there if I ever need it again. And that's enough. What I am left with, on the other side of all of it, is something I didn't expect to find. I know who stayed. Patricia stayed, from the first morning, practical and unshockable. Biscuit stayed, which sounds small but is not. My mother came back, and she came back the way she does everything. Squarely, without drama, with her chin up. Daniel came back and owned the fact that he had been late about it. Megan came back running. The ones who didn't show up when I needed them showed me something too. I am not going to be dramatic about that. It cost me something to find it out, but it is useful information. You learn who people are in the crisis, not before, not after, in it. I am 52 years old. I have been a nurse for 24 years. I own a townhouse in Barrie with afternoon light in the kitchen, and a borrowed golden retriever and a filing cabinet I don't need to open. I have a daughter who calls twice a week, and a brother who now texts me random photos of his kids' hockey games. I have a mother who drives 40 minutes to see my hydrangeas. I am, I think, more myself than I have been in a very long time. The morning I walked back out of my house on Ridgewood Crescent, I sat in my driveway for 11 minutes counting time on the dashboard clock. I was trying to hold on to something while everything shifted underneath me. I didn't know it then, but I was holding on to the right things. The work, the folder, the friend with the practical voice and the dog with the driftwood. I didn't scream that morning. I didn't throw the coffee mug. I picked up my bag and I walked back to my car, and I said 3 words out loud to no one in particular, just to hear myself say something true. I said, "I'll be fine." And it turned out, eventually, that I was right.